In Australia, cherries make me think of Christmas because they're absolutely ripe and delicious at this time. But I'm getting ahead of myself because it's the first day of spring in Australia and the tree is only just about to burst into bloom. Hi, I'm Robin and I've been filming my small edible garden for about the last year on YouTube, and this week I'm going to be featuring cherries. They are the perfect cool climate plant, but not the perfect small garden plant, but there are things you can do to have cherries in your own small garden. I've been filming the tree over the whole year, and I'll talk about growing cherries in a cool climate, in a small garden, and some of the things that you can do to get a lovely yield. They're actually a beautiful tree all year round. It's not just about the fruit. They have the most gorgeous blossom, the leaves are beautiful, and they have an autumn presence, and so they're a worthy plant in any garden. Aside from appreciating the flowers, there's not much to do with your cherry tree in spring. The thing that affects your yield in spring are things around the weather. A late frost when your flowers are just about to open, or some very heavy winds that ruin the blooms. Covering the tree can help with a late frost. And I haven't done this, but I did hear that a local orchardist burnt little mini bonfires under their fruit trees to ward off a late frost. It is definitely time to harvest my cherries. This is a juvenile crimson rosella having a snack. There are a lot of cherry pips under this tree, and if you're serious about having a good harvest, you really probably need to net your tree. If you do choose to cover your tree with bird netting, you'll need to be on top of the pruning to keep the tree small enough to cover it. But also make sure you choose wildlife-friendly netting. Cherries don't particularly sweeten up once harvested, so make sure you're harvesting as close to ripe as possible. And again, birds always like their cherries slightly underdone compared to us. I'm going to actually have a go at a scarecrow this year, but what does help to discombobulate the birds is if you can plant a lot of flowers and colour in and around the tree. And it's not as aesthetically pleasing, but if you keep the branches low into the undergrowth, I do find you get some cherries on the low branches. The birds sit at the top of the tree and eat in a more safer environment up the top. If you're in an area that is susceptible to disease, it's best to only prune your cherry tree in late summer, just after the harvest. I don't seem to have that issue here, and I have pruned my tree into winter, well into winter. But everybody's microclimate is different. But one of the issues with pruning is that the more you cut off, the less yield you'll have. Normally I cut this Royal Rainier cherry down really hard to keep it small, but I get a very low yield on it most years, and so this year I've only just taken off one large branch, and I'm just going to leave it to see as an experiment what kind of yield I get. Cherry trees only live for about 20 years, and so it's highly likely that the tree is also reaching the end of its life cycle. Choosing a cherry tree on dwarf rootstock is the answer to having a manageable sized tree in a small garden. The trees on dwarf rootstock also respond much better to pruning. I follow the basic principles of pruning, sort of trying to open up the tree into a bit of a goblet shape and cutting off inward facing branches and branches that are crossing and rubbing against each other or dead or diseased. And also cut off the suckers that are growing up around the base of the tree. When pruning, if you're wondering which branches have fruit or leaves, the branches with the clusters are the fruit buds, and the branches with lots of little buds along the stem are the leaf buds. And so look after your fruit buds. But there's a big cluster of fruit buds right at the end of a very long branch. You might consider taking that one off, as it's probably not going to do much. So if you're planning to grow your own cherry in your own small garden, here are some things to consider. They're not a great container plant, so even if you have a large container, they won't respond very well to that. So you'll need a bit of ground to put them in. They like full sun, a nice well-drained soil, but they're not that particular, not heavy clay. As I mentioned earlier, go for a a variety with a dwarf rootstock, and I'll leave that in the description. And there are some varieties that are self-pollinating, and so you don't need to have 2 trees. It can be very tempting to experiment with growing your own plant from seed, but I would say that the cherries are not great for that either. They don't come true to seed. They'll cross-pollinate with whatever's around and produce their own new Frankenstein. And so generally they're not very tasty what you get, although, you know, you might get lucky and discover the next wonderful variety. I lived in a rental many years ago that had a very unkept backyard full of, it was a cherry tree forest, all self-seeded, and as much as that sounds exciting, they were in fact all of them not particularly palatable. The taste wasn't there, the seeds were big, and there wasn't much flesh. In one of my previous episodes, I talked about growing your own yuzu lemon, because that seed comes true. So if you're going to experiment with seeds, experiment with a plant that tends to come true to seed. By the way, the yuzus are doing really well, and they're still hanging in there. Well, thank you for watching on this first day of spring. The air is full of peach, nectarine, and plum blossoms at the moment. The cherry blossoms are yet to come because you were looking at last year's blossoms. It's a really windy month in my region here, and it's been a challenge to film outside. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all the subscriptions and lovely comments. I'm going to leave you with a Dutch 18th century cherry flan recipe, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye.